A bark sounded. The next moment the figure of an aggressive white poodle bounded around the corner. It was Cherry who dropped her sweet demeanor and pulled her lips back, growling. Just a meter in front of the Jack-in-the-Box, the dog stopped moving forward, shifting her front legs and taking a slightly crouched defensive position. Cherry courageously confronted the threat that had come to the Gibsons' house in the form of a toy. Their focus was on preventing the evil creature from making further progress and thus keeping the danger away from their human masters. Knowing that he wouldn't be able to get past the female poodle without a fight, the fool let out a hiss that could only leave cold goosebumps on anyone who would hear it. Holding the tiny dagger ready to strike, he made an abrupt leap towards the poodle. At the same time, Cherry's mouth extended to snap at the incarnated doll. The jester's thrust speed was a fraction of a second faster. The blade of the dagger entered the dog's body above her left leg as the boxing devil felt her breath above him. Torn in pain, Cherry let out a yelp as she instinctively backed away, the dagger blade withdrawn from the injury. Even though the blade of the dagger was only a few centimeters long, it was enough to leave the little dog with a bleeding wound, which also resulted in a sharp pain. As she rushed backwards, Cherry didn't pay attention to where she was going. Her abdomen collided with a leg of the glass table in the corner of the corridor. The collision caused the lampshade to wobble on the tabletop and, after wobbling back and forth several times, it fell forward. The lamp fell violently onto Cherry, with the lampshade hitting the back of her head. The female poodle yelped again. She began to sway as her vision gradually became blurry. Finally the dog was overcome by a fit of weakness and she collapsed senseless next to the fallen umbrella lamp. Highly satisfied with what he saw as a pleasant outcome from an unpleasant encounter, the fool let out a derisive chuckle. After a short concentration, however, he realized that the dog's pulse and breathing could still be detected. She wasn't dead, just unconscious. Without his demonic grin fading, the Jack-in-the-Box looked down at the dagger blade stained with dog blood. With the intention of slashing the unconscious animal's stomach, the fool went straight towards it when suddenly there were quick footsteps coming from the corridor behind the bend in the corridor. Someone had become aware of the unavoidable noises. To avoid detection, the tiny demon fool quickly ran to the side to press himself against the wall. Just a moment later a shadow appeared, followed by a tall, beefy man. It was probably a bodyguard on night duty. Similar to his two colleagues who had accompanied the Gibson children and their butler at the fair, he was wearing a dark suit, under whose jacket a weapon was certainly hidden in a shoulder holster. The security man's facial expressions fell apart when he saw the unconscious poodle lying on the floor in close proximity to the stuffed fox next to the umbrella lamp that had fallen off the table. What just happened here? The bodyguard asked himself when he spotted Cherry. The fool's mood changed. All of a sudden anger flared up in him. The very thing he had been afraid of had happened. This guy had to be neutralized immediately before he alerted Robert Gibson and his wife, which also meant the whole plan would come to an abrupt end. Without being noticed by the bodyguard, the jester moved back to the middle of the corridor. He didn't take his eyes off the man, whose face was full of confusion. Summoning one of its main powers, which came from black magic, the living doll shifted its posture. Suddenly the shadow cast by the Jack-in-the-Box apparition grew many times its original size. It was as if a shadow creature of its own had manifested itself and was moving at breakneck speed towards the still unsuspecting man. Watching the whole thing, the fool made a few movements, raising his arms in the air. It seemed as if he was directing the movements of the shadow creature with his own movements. As he opened his mouth, the shadow also opened his mouth. The shadow of the Jack-in-the-Box came unnoticed behind the bodyguard as he was about to rise from his crouch. Continuing to coordinate the movements of the giant shadow, the fool ensured that his right shadow hand wrapped around one of the bodyguard's shoulders, which in the next moment knocked him off his feet. The other hand immediately grabbed the victim's mouth and chin. The superhuman strength that she increasingly developed ensured that a frightened outcry was nipped in the bud. Meanwhile, the writhing body of the overwhelmed man was pulled further up. Moving backwards, the jester directed the shadow and the victim into the corridor in which it was located. Then he suddenly stopped and made a jerky movement with his arms and hands, which was also carried out by the shadow at the same time. With a cracking of bones, the man's neck broke, and his body immediately went limp. Finally the jester doll got his shadow to place the lifeless body on the red carpeted floor. Everyone gets what they deserve, the fool thought to himself as he crept past the bodyguard's corpse. After a moment to take a breather, he continued down the other corridor. Due to the excitement he had been through, he forgot about the poodle, which was still lying unconscious in the opposite corner. After the fool had walked a little around the corner, he noticed the open door of a room on the right. He carefully crept up to look into the room beyond. A white wingback chair and a turned-on television showing a replay of a football game were among the things in the room. The assumption was that the bodyguard had been in here before. Footsteps and the closing of a door some distance away made the fool turn around in alarm. He immediately hid his small figure behind the frame of the open door. His shadow also merged with the shapeless shadows on the walls. The fool carefully peeked behind the wooden door frame. Near the other end of the hallway, a blonde woman in a silk dressing gown had emerged from one of the rooms. She seemed to be lost in thought, which was to the Jack-in-the-Box's benefit because she didn't notice him or the distant chaos. The woman, who was in her mid-40s but looked much younger, walked a few meters towards the hidden fool before stopping in front of a door on the left, which she opened. It was Ellen Gibson who disappeared into one of the home's 3 bathrooms. Clenching his free hand into a fist, the fool's face contorted into a murderous expression. The time to fulfill his mission had come. Robert Gibson's wife was supposed to die before her husband, and now the Jack-in-the-Box knew where to find her. With a step that was brisk for his little legs, he crept towards the bathroom, the door of which was ajar. A feeling of diabolical excitement spread inside him. Ellen looked into the large bathroom mirror. She picked up the brush from the shelf above the sink. She absent-mindedly brushed it through her long blonde hair. A long, tiring day lay behind her. It was now shortly after midnight and she was increasingly tired. Nevertheless, Ellen was reluctant to climb into bed with her husband at the moment. Their marriage had changed in recent years. Ellen was no longer as happy as she had been when she met Robert almost 20 years ago. It started shortly after the birth of her second child. Her husband Robert had become increasingly preoccupied with his political offices. First, his years of work as governor. Robert had been aiming for the highest office of all for some time. A goal that her husband had never been closer to achieving than during this time. Robert's steady upward mobility had brought wealth and fame. The dark side of it all was that they had become targets for more than just the press. No matter where members of her family went, they were always accompanied by at least 2 bodyguards. This also applies to her children's trip to the fairground today. One of these bodyguards was even in the house at night, on the same floor. Robert had him set up a TV room. Much worse for Ellen than the constant presence of strangers in her life was the increasing alienation from her husband. It had been a long time since Robert looked at her with the unconditional love he had when they were a young couple who met at college, their heads still full of naive dreams. Today his gaze was often filled with an indifferent coldness that took everything around him for granted. Ellen couldn't remember the last time Robert had given her a serious compliment. Their life together had become a purely marital routine. Sometimes Ellen believed that her husband's focus on the political office he wanted to hold was increasingly pushing aside everything else that had once been important to him. Ellen regretted not getting married. Robert had been a wonderful husband in the early years. Together they had 2 children and this large country house, far from the hustle and bustle of the nearest big city. However, like almost all married couples, she occasionally wondered what her life would have been like if she hadn't met Robert Gibson while studying at university. Who would she have ended up with then? Perhaps Ellen would have become the wife of a common laborer, or she would have lived a much more modest life on a farm. Whatever would have happened, in the end fate had a different plan for life. The decision she had made as a young woman had been the right one, otherwise Jamie and Kathy would never have been born. Ultimately, it was her children who gave her the strength to carry on every day despite all her worries and to accept her role as a wife. Ellen secretly hoped that Robert was just going through a phase in an eventful time for the Gibsons. Once the period of tension that came with being in the public eye was over, perhaps Robert would come to his senses and become the tender man she had once known and loved. Kathy wanted to be loyal to him for so long. Intending to banish the dark thoughts from her mind for tonight, Ellen leaned her upper body slightly toward the sink to turn the faucet halfway on and wash her hands again before going to bed. Before she had finished, the creaking of the ajar bathroom door reached her ears from behind. Ellen Gibson immediately looked into the mirror hanging on the tiled wall in front of her. As if by magic, the bathroom door swung open without anyone standing in the doorway. Ellen spun around in surprise. "Is there anyone?" she asked instinctively. Thinking for a moment, she frowned. Ellen thought of her son, probably trying to play one of his stupid pranks on her again, even though the next Halloween was still a few weeks away. "Is that you, Jamie?" she continued in a stern voice. "Listen, young man, if you hid behind the door to give me a real scare instead of lying in bed and sleeping, then today was the last excursion that she would go on for a long time will have." Angrily, Ellen Gibson wanted to go towards the open door when suddenly something jumped from the side through the door frame into the bathroom. The thing that suddenly stood in front of her was significantly smaller than Jamie. It was a moving doll dressed like a fool. Ellen immediately remembered the disgusting boxing devil that Jamie had brought home from the fairground. "No, that can't be right," Ellen whispered to herself this time. She shook her head in disbelief. But there was no chance of a mistake. Except for the legs that she had grown, the walking jester doll resembled the Jack-in-the-Box down to the smallest detail. The only difference that stood out was the malicious desire for murder that was written on the fool's face, which was covered in scars and furrows. "What is that thing?" said Ellen, her voice filled with terror. The uneasy feeling in the pit of her stomach fueled the certainty that the doll in the black box was no longer her son's toy. She had transformed into a living creature that had neither a soul nor any scruples. Her nature was evil through and through. It was created with the purpose of serving an even darker lord and carrying out bloody deeds on his behalf. The bathroom door slammed behind the bogeyman without anyone even touching it. Grinning darkly, the Jack-in-the-Box raised an object in his hands that Ellen identified as a dagger with a tiny blade. A weapon of this size would have to come very close to a full-grown human and be wielded with extreme precision to pose a serious threat. But the fool was no longer alone with Ellen. The shadow cast by the doll grew in size and, a few breaths later, loomed almost all the way to the bathroom ceiling in front of Ellen. With him, the shadow of the dagger in his right hand had grown unnaturally. The shadow, which towered 6 times over the fool, seemed to be controlled solely by his movements. So the Jack-in-the-Box darted his left arm forward with his free hand, spreading the fingers in a grasping motion. His giant shadow version did the same and grabbed the human victim's neck. A scream of terror that Ellen let out from her throat was silenced after a single split second as the superhuman-sized shadow hand wrapped around her neck as if she were made of flesh and blood. The increasingly powerful fingers squeezed Ellen's larynx, whereupon every sound she made fell silent. Her silk-slippered feet lost contact with the tiled bathroom floor as she was lifted several centimeters by the arm that far outstripped her in physical strength. At the mercy of the monster shadow, Ellen punched and kicked desperately. However, her futile resistance quickly died down as she was mercilessly smashed with her back against the bathroom mirror. Instantly, an extremely intense pain exploded in Ellen, almost knocking her unconscious. The mirror behind her cracked several times and shards of glass clattered to the floor in 2 places. The woman's body limped weakly, but the shadow did not release it from its control. From a safe distance, the fool carried out all the movements that were transferred to the shadow. When the opportunity for a fatal finale came, he brought down the blade of the dagger as if he wanted to cut something with it. Like a real blade of steel, the tip of the shadow dagger cut through the top of Ellen's dressing gown. After the shadow blade cut through the fine silk once, the dressing gown fell apart in half. Ellen's breasts and remaining front flesh were exposed. Something lustful shimmered in the fool's eyes as he paused briefly and looked at the exposed parts of his victim's body. Ellen Gibson was still an unusually beautiful woman with a tight body and tight skin. She remained untouched by any doctor's scalpels. Ellen has never had to undergo cosmetic surgery. It's actually a real shame, thought the fool. However, he knew that he could not wait any longer to carry out the order. As if it were made of real steel, the enlarged shadow version of the dagger blade swept across the bare skin of the female torso, which was covered in sweat. At a point less than an inch to the right of Ellen's left tit, the cold blade tip lingered briefly. Then the jester doll yanked up her right arm, which the shadow did likewise. Sensing that her end had come, Ellen's body tensed even more. The strangled scream from her throat became a rattle until the pain exploded through her brood. The moment the fool lowered his dagger arm, the shadow blade also swung down towards its victim. It penetrated precisely through the skin and the flesh underneath, between the bones of the protective ribcage. The heart racing with mortal fear was wounded before the shadow blade was withdrawn from the wound. Again and again the puppet hand of the Jack-in-the-Box stabbed down with the miniature dagger, which his shadow, which was huge in comparison, did the same. Fountains of blood spurted from the enlarging stab wound. Drops of blood splatter onto the tiles and sink, leaving a chaotic pattern. Ecstatic from the bloodlust that was once again reaching a climax, the Jack-in-the-Box rolled his eyes. He still obsessively repeated the thrusting movements of the dagger, even though the life had long since drained from Ellen Gibson and her body had gone limp. When the fool awoke from the violent trance, a pool of blood had formed on the floor tiles. After putting his puppet dagger back in its sheath, the Jack-in-the-Box ensured that his shadow deposited Ellen Gibson's body. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the dead woman lying in her own blood. No matter how urgent the time, even a demon doll fool demanded a reward for all his efforts. Craving for fresh human blood, he went to the half-naked woman's body. The powerful feeling of ecstasy he had felt as his shadow stabbed the victim had passed with the completion of the deed. Now he wanted more. Emitting a sort of moan of pleasure, the living boxing devil climbed onto Ellen Gibson's corpse. The mouth in his horrible face opened and a narrow tongue protruded from it, split at the front like a snake's. The tongue grew until it was longer than the doll's figure. The forked tip of her tongue slowly stroked the skin around the gaping stab wound near her breasts. The salty taste of fierce sweat secreted from the skin pores a moment before death, coupled with the slightly metallic note of blood spatters, created a most ecstatic tingling sensation on the fool's tongue buds. Just as his eyes rolled back in the satisfaction of his desires, Ellen, an angry-sounding male voice came from behind the bathroom door. It belonged to Robert Gibson. "Is everything okay with you?" I heard banging and screaming. There was another knock. When no one answered, the door handle was pushed down. Since the door was neither locked nor was there anything blocking it, it was opened inwards. Angry at having been interrupted in collecting payment for the commissioned atrocity before its completion, the puppet fool withdrew his tongue again. Putting on his diabolical grin, he turned around on the corpse of his first victim.